The Haitian Revolution is the only successful slave revolt in human history, and this monumental fact owes its existence to the unique situation that developed on the island of Hispaniola. The island of Hispaniola lies in the Greater Antilles archipelago and is the second largest island next to Cuba. The original inhabitants of the island were the Arawak/Taino people, who called the island Haiti and lived in small independent kingdoms. The Taino had two distinct social classes of nobles and commoners and traced their chiefs, called caciques, matrilineally. They were skilled farmers and fishers and could navigate the waters with their large dugout canoes. Europeans first arrived on the island when Christopher Columbus landed at Hispaniola on December 6, 1492, at the small bay of Mole St. Nicholas on the north coast of what is now modern-day Haiti. After failing to establish a settlement in November 1493, they established La Isabela in January 1494. The Spanish coming to the island proved disastrous for the native Arawak/Taino population, as they were brutally forced to work in Spanish mines by being subjected to new diseases such as smallpox by the foreign invaders. By 1508, the Taino population of about 400,000 was reduced to 60,000, and by 1514, only about 26,000 remained. By May 1519, it is thought as many as one-third of the remaining Tainos had died. By the height of French colonization of Saint Domingue, the indigenous society of the island had all but disappeared. The French presence on the island started with French pirates creating small bases on the coast, which eventually led to the establishment of a permanent settlement on the nearby island of Tortuga in 1625. In 1665, French colonization of the island was officially recognized by King Louis XIV. The French colony was given the name Saint Domingue, and by 1697, after conflict with France and its allies, Spain formally ceded the western third of the island to France in the Treaty of Ryswick. Saint Domingue grew quickly, with an expanding slave labor agricultural economy. By 1789, Saint Domingue produced 60% of the world's coffee and 40% of the sugar imported by France and Britain. The colony was not only the most profitable possession of the French colonial empire, but it was the wealthiest and most prosperous colony in the Caribbean, earning its nickname the Pearl of the Antilles. The colony of Saint Domingue had a unique social hierarchy with distinct social classes. There were the big whites, the rich owner class that owned most of the plantations and property in the colony, yet most of them had little interest in actually living in Saint Domingue and would rather live in France. The small whites, who came to Saint Domingue looking to seek their fortune, but most were relegated to low-paying, non-labor administrative jobs and as overseers on plantations. The free-colored, the offspring of white and black parents, had more wealth than the small whites, having been more established on the island and being able to own property. They also served in the militia and police forces, an unpopular occupation. The wealthiest of the free colors owning plantations themselves, but not being welcomed into the ranks of the big whites. And last, but most importantly, the enslaved African population, who made up the majority of the people living in the colony, with the colony's white population numbered 40,000, mulattoes and free blacks 28,000, and black slaves that estimated 452,000 in 1789, and did all the backbreaking and dangerous labor that made Saint Domingue so lucrative. Slavery in Saint Domingue was particularly brutal due to the cheapness of slave labor compared to the profits to be made from cash crops like sugar, coffee, and indigo. And the viral nature of tropical diseases on the island, the economic rationale was to work slaves to death and buy replacement slaves instead of caring for the existing population. Because of this, 2/3 of the slaves were African-born, as the native population died too quickly to be the majority. The average life expectancy of an enslaved person being only 21. African people, who were imported from all over West and Central Africa, entered a hellish environment where work was hard and punishment was cruel. Enslaved toiled under the hot Caribbean sun from sunup to sundown in the fields under the watch of armed overseers, harvesting the cash crops for France. The machines used to process things like sugarcane were dangerous, often crushing the limbs of those operating them. Any form of resistance would be dealt with swiftly, with punishments that range from whippings that, based on the number of blows, outcome could range from painful wounds and scarring to death, to devilish executions like being boiled alive in molten sugar vats or blown up with gunpowder charges. All of these actions had the same goal: to break the spirit of the enslaved. Despite the fiendish conditions placed on them, enslaved African people found ways to resist their oppression and in some cases throw off the bonds of slavery entirely. One of the most common forms of resistance was for people to simply walk off the plantation en masse. This was not to run away, but rather to leverage better treatment or the firing of a particularly cruel overseer. Once conditions were met, they would come back. Working at a slower pace or pretending not to understand commands was another form of self-preservation and resistance. Poisoning was another tactic, one plantation staff especially feared because it would be difficult to tell the difference between poison and the various diseases and ailments that were rampant on the island. Lastly, some enslaved African people would escape the plantation altogether, traveling to the hard-to-reach places on the island like the mountainous regions and the wetlands, sometimes intermixing with the native populations. They formed societies known as Maroons, the name coming from the word cimarron, meaning wild pig, a common practice for enslaved Africans in the Americas. These groups defended their freedom through their isolation and by strength of arms. The tactics they employed would come to play in the Revolution. The colony of Saint Domingue's social classes, with their different interests and roles, created a unique balancing act that, if disturbed, would lead to conflict. This balancing would first be challenged after the French National Assembly published the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen on August 26, 1789, declaring all men free and equal during the events of the French Revolution. There was great debate in Saint Domingue if the Declaration's language of equality applied to women, slaves, and other denizens of the colony, but all sides saw the Declaration and the larger French Revolution as a way to influence the island towards their interests. The white planters of the Big Whites saw it as an opportunity to gain independence from a destabilizing France, which would allow them to take control of the island and ignore trade regulations that stopped them from trading outside of France, furthering their own wealth and power. The small whites saw the enfranchisement of the wealthy free-colored as directly opposed to their interests and allied with the big whites to create a race-based order that would put them above the free-colored based off of their whiteness. While the free-colored felt the Declaration only reinforced the rights they always had and put them in their rightful place as equals to the big whites, but they opposed notions of emancipation, as they were a slave-owning class like the big whites and did not feel a kinship with the enslaved. These tensions continued to rise until open conflict was inevitable. In October 1790, a wealthy free man of color, Vincent Ogé, demanded the right to vote as given under the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. When the colonial governor of Saint Domingue refused, Ogé led a 300-man insurgency around the area of Le Cap. This was short-lived. He was captured and executed by being broken on the wheel. In June and July of 1790, the big whites, with the aid of the small whites, had a revolt of their own. As a reaction to the French National Assembly declaring free men of color, born of free parents, could vote and have seats on assemblies on May 15, 1790. As the whites, free-colored, and government forces fought amongst themselves, the enslaved population of the island started to see an opportunity for a real revolution. Now, there had been revolutions on the island before, like the Mackandal Rebellion of 1759, led by the Maroon leader, Mackandal, but all had been unsuccessful and put down. Plans started to form, and on around August 14th, 1791, at Bois Cayman, a woods near the city of Le Cap, the leaders of what was to become the Haitian Revolution gathered, led by Duty Bookman, a Maroon leader and a Voodoo Hogan priest, and Salif Fatiman, a Voodoo Mambo. This meeting was both a religious ceremony and a strategy meeting. Other leaders in attendance were Jean-Francois, Bizassou, Janot, and many others, with about 200 people in attendance altogether. At Bois Cayman, Bookman gave the following speech.
The good Lord, who created the sun, which gives us light from above, who rouses the sea and makes the thunder roar. Listen well, all of you. This God, hidden in the clouds, watches us. He sees all that the white people do. The God of the white people demands from them crimes. Our God asks for good deeds. But this God, who is so good, demands vengeance. He will direct our hands. He will aid us. Throw away the image of the God of the whites who thirsts for our tears. Listen to the voice of liberty, which speaks in the hearts of all of us.
In the next few weeks, thousands of people would take to the field, torches and machetes in hand. The revolution had begun.
The Historical African Martial Arts Association's Hero Series celebrates the great military leaders of Africa's past. Order yours today at teespring.com.